Welcome to Between the Lines. Today we're going to discuss who Ellen White really was and how she would have interpreted herself if she were here with us today. Someone who has spent a lot of time getting to know her intimately, her life and times, is George Knight, the author of 32 plus books. Dr. Knight, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here, Samuel.
I want to ask you how Ellen White would define herself. If we had her sitting here today, how would she talk about her writings?
Well, that's a good question because I've thought about Ellen White ever since I've been an Adventist Christian, and I've come to two conclusions. She's the best thing that ever happened to the Adventist Church, and she's the worst thing that ever happened to the Adventist Church. And part of that second one is the way people have misused her writings. And this is something that hasn't only happened since she passed away nearly 100 years ago, but it was happening during her lifetime. And as a result, some years ago, I got the idea that we could learn a lot about Ellen White and how to read and interpret her writings by seeing how she interpreted them.
Now, George, you've written 4 books, Reading Ellen White, Walking with Ellen White, Meeting Ellen White, and also Ellen White's World. But when you talk about her in this Reading Ellen White, you talk about her making a distinction between the ideal and the real.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where I have seen so many people get tripped up. How would you say she would view that distinction, or how she would make that distinction?
Well, she was a very realistic person. And I often tell people that you can make a statement about God's ideal that's very, very high. And Ellen White didn't have any problem with ideal statements. This is God's will for humanity. But when it came to real people, and she could see their poverty or their ignorance or the struggles they had, she dealt with the real world in which they lived. Let me give you an illustration. Back in the late 1910s, she wrote, well, I'm going to have to go back. In the 1890s, she wrote that education should always take place in the country, separated a wide distance from the cities. That was her ideal. And I'll tell you what, I've been principal in an inner city school, and you couldn't get to my place without passing totally nude joints with all the advertisements on the outside. I know what inner city work is. I understand why it's good to be in the country. Well, when she wrote that, that was her ideal. She was talking about the Avondale School, which was to be a model for Adventist schools around the world, and it was. Most of our schools, many of them are still rural institutions. But then came the evangelism in the cities. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other places. 1909. She writes that it would be good if all schools could be outside the cities, but watch that word, but inside the cities, there are people that don't have the means, don't have the money to go out and educate their children or to send them away. So for those people, we ought to have schools in the city.
So is that where we get this contradiction, or I don't want to say contradiction, we get an apparent contradiction that people perceive that she's making, that she's saying ideal, but here's very real need, so therefore we have to address it.
And of course she doesn't use that terminology, but that's obviously what she's doing. Here is God's ideal, but here's where the people are. For example, in 1903 she said it would be wonderful if every child could have their parents as teachers. But she says, And she wrote a statement on that. But some parents aren't capable, and some aren't able. Therefore, we need schools where these really young children can go. And so, once again, we have the ideal. The role of parenthood as it would be in a perfect world, and then the reality that not all parents are situated or even capable of educating their own children until they're 8 or 9, 10 years of age, is what she was talking about.
So why do we get so hung up on these distinctive differences?
Well, because we have never discovered how Ellen White read her own writings. What we do is we come along and we take out the strongest statements, that is the ideal statements. In fact, I will quote from her out of Third Selected Messages. This is a paraphrase. She says, and she was talking about health reform, she says, I understand that people are making a test on health reform and making a raid upon the people. She says they don't pay attention to the context in which the statements were written. They don't pay attention to who they were written to, what their problems were, but they go through my writings and they pick out the strongest statements, that would be the ideal statements, and push them upon everybody. Therefore, she says, they create her writings as a whip to drive the people. And this is what I say is the worst thing that ever happened to the church, is that people have misused Ellen White because they haven't paid attention to how she used herself.
But I think that so often people want to go to the ideal because they say, well, this is really where the Lord wants us anyway, so we should always be striving to that. So they tend to minimize and therefore probably through their process marginalize these contrasting statements. So they never hear them. They don't really see them.
No. Usually what we see in what I call is a self-made compilation is something taken out of its literary and its historical context. And then just the strongest statements selected. And what we have is we have people creating Ellen White in their own image. If they're inflexible, if they can only think about something that's so heavenly that they can't live on earth, Now, I think we ought to approximate the ideal. Don't get me wrong. And Ellen White believed that we ought to approximate God's ideal. But she was also willing to say, hey, God knows where you are. He knows where you started. He knows how you're progressing. And He meets you where you are. And that's not so different from where Jesus was it?
No, it's not at all.
I mean, what did His enemies say? He was a wine bibber and a glutton? I mean, let's face it, His most successful work was with publicans and prostitutes? Come on now. Yeah, it was the church people who gave Him all the trouble. In fact, they put Him on the cross because He didn't interpret the Sabbath strictly enough.
Well, she had her problem with the church people as well.
Yeah. But what we have to recognize is each of us comes with our own baggage. Each of us has our own spiritual sicknesses, and too many of us impute the same problems that we have into the writings of Ellen White.
So Ellen White really was more of a real person we give her credit for.
Yeah. In fact, years ago I wrote a book called Myths in Adventism, which is soon to be republished, and the first chapter was The Myth of the Inflexible Prophet.